Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to be here with you today in this beautiful area on a nice spring day. We haven't had too many of these, so it's a good opportunity to be together with like-minded people and to talk about issues that are related to water, which are near and dear to all of us. As an economist, I want to address the question of who pays the cost of water pollution and water depletion. Whenever water is polluted in our streams or our groundwater, or whenever the aquifers are depleted by overuse, someone has imposed the cost of pollution prevention and conservation on someone else. And really, the bottom line is that the person who pays the cost, or the persons who pay the cost, are society as a whole, including those people of future generations that will be just as dependent upon having adequate supplies of clean and safe water as we are here today. Whenever we have pollution and depletion, the people who commit those acts and deplete and pollute are not paying the economic cost, or at least not cost anything in relation to the benefits that they expect to receive economically from their continued pollution. If the economic cost to them were as high as the benefits, then they would stop those particular kind of actions. We can see the cost of water pollution in the reduced value of recreation for swimming and for fishing and for other things that we do in the water, the canoeing and so on. We can see the cost in the reduced value of commercial fishing in our streams and in the Gulf and in other places in the lakes and so on. We can see the cost in the polluted wells of people that live near these operations, or people that live in areas where the water is polluted and they have to abandon the wells or install high-cost equipment to remove the biological and chemical pollutants from their drinking water. And there's many sources of those, as you've heard talked about today. Industry has been a big source, and we've heard referred to that as the point source pollution that primarily has come from industry. But for us today, we've addressed many of those point source pollution issues, again, as you've heard today, but the non-point source that remains largely unregulated is a pollution that occurs because when water falls across an area or flows across an area and into the streams or into the lakes or elsewhere over a wide range of area. And the number one source of non-point source pollution of streams in this country has been identified as industrial agriculture. It's the chemical runoff from the agricultural fields, the cropping operations, from the pollutants from the fertilizers, the nitrogen and phosphorus and the pesticides. But it's also the biological contamination that come from the large-scale confinement animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. It's difficult to deal with the non-point source, as we've heard here today, because oftentimes you have pollution from multiple sources that come together in a place where you're polluting the streams, or in the case even from the groundwater. It's also difficult to identify those risks because many of the risks, and I would argue the most important risks and costs that are associated with non-point source pollution today, are the public health risk that's associated with chemical and biological contamination of the streams and of the groundwater here today. And those are the risks that are left largely unregulated today. It's difficult to measure those risks and to identify a specific cause for a specific effect. But I would argue that that is no excuse to ignore or to refuse to take the precautions that are necessary to protect the public from very real and present health risks that are here today. I would argue that in many cases we know that the costs to society in general and to individuals in society are far greater than any economic benefits that society might gain from it. For example, whenever we've had a CAFO or the current confinement animal feeding operations pollute the water, like in Ontario, and people die and people are sick, the cost to those people are far in excess of any benefits they might expect to receive out of it. Whenever we have water polluted with antibiotic-resistant bacteria and we have people that go to the hospitals or go to the doctors and there's no treatment for what they have, the cost of those people and the cost of society in general from health care far outweighs any economic benefits we might receive in terms of the cost of food. The operations that pollute continue to pollute because they have no expectation that society will force them to pay the cost. And so they continue to impose the cost on the rest of us. And whenever there's an effort to establish regulations based on the studies that are there today, they argue that the scientific evidence is inconclusive, is what they say. And as you heard from Paul Johnson this morning, they used to call for good science and common sense. You don't hear that much anymore. Why is that? Because the scientific evidence is piling up against the industrial agricultural operations, and the common sense has always been against the industrialization of agriculture. We were urged to be fair and balanced today. I'm being fair and I'm being balanced. I'm basing my truth on common sense and good science. There's pollution from many sources, as I've said before. But we've regulated many of the point source pollutions from the industrial operations. And you've heard about the improvement in water qualities in our streams and our lakes as a consequence of that. And that's far from perfect, and there's still much to be done. But we're addressing those issues. But at the same time, the number one non-point source of pollution, industrial agriculture, remains largely unregulated and defended in maintaining its right to be unregulated. I argue that that probably comes from the idea that we're defending agriculture because traditional agriculture, real agriculture, was fundamentally different than an industry. It was diverse crop and livestock operations, so you depended upon the diversity of nature to detoxify the waste and to replenish the groundwater and replenish the surface water. And agriculture was dispersed with the animals and the crops raised out across the fields. And in history, I would argue that in agriculture it was justified to be exempt because dispersion had proved to be a good prevention or at least mitigant for pollution under those situations that we typically find in agriculture. But the dominant form of agriculture today is not characteristic of traditional agriculture of the past. It's large, specialized, standardized, consolidated operations, whether we're talking about crops or livestock. It is industrial agriculture. It is far more like a factory than is like a farm. We can talk about water depletion in the same sense. The groundwater, the fossil water, by some estimates, roughly half of the total fossil water, meaning water in slow recharging or non-recharging aquifers, half of it is already gone. And we have great rivers across the country like the Colorado River that are running dry because the water is being used for municipal water, but also agricultural water before it gets there. And when the reservoirs, the drinking water reservoirs run dry, as they have in some recent years, then there's lack of drinking water for the municipalities that depend upon those. And we're looking at climate change ahead. There's going to be more and more times when there's going to be people without drinking water because we've depleted the water supply. Society pays the cost of water depletion. The people that deplete gain the economic benefits. There's a number of estimates. You've heard some of those today. Industrial use in total, from the estimates I found, use about 60% of the water. About 90% of industrial use is in mining. About 13% is in turf grass. Agriculture uses about 30%, according to the estimates I have. And that is about 3 times as much as we use for drinking water in municipalities. And it's about twice as much as industry uses when you take out mining and take out the turf grass. Agriculture is a major water user, a major water depleter under the situations that we have today. Now, much of that, as you heard, is for irrigation, and that's a big source or a big user of agriculture water all across the country, but it's also in the confinement animal feeding operations because much of the irrigated farming is not just for the vegetables in California, but for corn and soybeans that go into the large-scale confinement animal feeding operations. And again, the estimates vary, but it takes about 2,000 gallons of water to produce 1 gallon of milk. It takes about 600 gallons of water to produce 1 hamburger, and this depends on how it's grown, but a tremendous amount of water goes into the food that we eat today. And with the exception of water in the western part of the country, agricultural water use remains very underregulated, in many cases unregulated. This unregulation or underregulation of water has large and growing cost for society as a whole, including those people of future generations that will be as dependent upon water as we are today. We made a major step forward, as you heard this afternoon, with the Clean Water Act of 1972. and we've cleaned up the rivers. The rivers no longer burn, and we've gotten a lot of the toxic waste out of those times. But in the meantime, we've continued the industrialization of agriculture, and whereas the water pollution problems from industrialization have grown less and less over time, the water pollution associated with agriculture, I argued, if we had the courage to measure it, is going higher and higher and higher, in spite of the regulations that we have in effect. Industrial agriculture is not diverse. It doesn't give nature a chance to detoxify the water. It's not dispersed. It's all concentrated in one particular area. It's much like a factory, far more like a factory than it is like a real farm. I would still argue that real farms ought to be exempt from the regulations. Real farms being farms that are diverse, integrated crop and livestock systems, where the nutrients go back to the fields where the crop is grown rather than into the water supply. Real farms are individualized, not standardized. They're fit the farm to a particular place so that they can accommodate the nature of a particular place. And real farms, the production is dispersed across the area, where the rainfall falls in adequate quantities to replenish the water supply for the crops, and the waste is dispersed adequately so that it's dispersed out and doesn't pollute where it falls. The large-scale industrial agriculture is specialized, standardized, consolidated, concentrated in smaller and smaller places. Let me give you a couple of real quick examples. On a real farm, on a diversified farm, an organic, sustainable farm, the limiting resource on that farm is the ability to get the nutrients to be released from the organic matter in the soil, to make them available to the crop. That's the limiting factor. The farmer has the incentives to do everything they can to capture as many of those nutrients as they possibly can in order to maximize their yield and maximize their profitability. So there's very little, if anything, left to leach out into nature as a waste. In an industrial farming operation where you have the input-output of fertilizer, for example, there's an economic incentive to pollute. Let me take a ratio of $5 corn and $1 a pound nitrogen. And in general, this is roughing it out, but in general, an added pound of nitrogen will get you a bushel of corn. So $1 worth of nitrogen will get you $5 worth of corn, assuming that everything is right otherwise with respect to growing conditions and water and temperature and things of that nature. So the farmer then, in maximizing profit, has an incentive to put on enough nitrogen so that 1 year out of 5, even if he only gets the crop 1 year out of 5 that maximizes his return, then the return on that 1 year of that $5 bushel will more than offset the 5 pounds of nitrogen that he put on to get that yield. That says that 4 years out of 5, there will be excess nitrogen to leach into the water and go into the wells. And it's a purely economic decision to over-apply and pollute just by the simple nature of the operations. CAFOs also have an incentive to pollute. Why is that? Because in order to get the economic efficiencies of large-scale production, they have to concentrate too many animals in too small of space to possibly get the nutrients back to the fields where those crops were grown, so that you can have a healthy nutrient cycle without polluting the natural environment. And they talk about the manure being fertilizer, and they want to get it back on the field. It is if you can spread it close enough to the CAFO. But beyond some point, the cost of transportation to get it out there makes it a cost rather than a benefit. So they have an economic incentive to spread as much of it as they possibly can, as close to the CAFO as they can, and hope that as much of it as possible volatilizes into the air or is washed away into the stream so that they can apply even more so they don't have to transport it any farther. That's pure economics. The economic incentive is there to create biological and chemical production. Fair and balanced, that's the fact. That's straightforward economic profit maximization. Same thing with respect to pollution. It's economically efficient to concentrate all of the use of water in one space when you're talking about a large-scale confinement animal feeding operation. It's an economic benefit to irrigate so that you can produce as much as you can in as small a space as you can by applying chemicals and by applying fertilizers and pesticides to maximize the yield. That's what makes industrial agriculture profitable. But the fact that it makes it agriculturally profitable is the same thing that causes it to deplete and pollute, and the same thing that causes it to simply not be sustainable. And I could go on and on all afternoon because I helped create this industrial agriculture. And we intended that it would do something good when it created. But if we look honestly and sincerely at agriculture today, we have to admit that it is not meeting the needs of many people today, many people in this country, Hunger today is as great as it was in the 60s, and it certainly is not leaving equal or better opportunities for those of the future. It quite simply is not sustainable. Small, diverse, dispersed farming operations are perfectly capable of feeding the people. This idea that we have to have industrial agriculture to feed the people doesn't make any sense. It hasn't fed many people of the world today, as I said before. And if you look at the facts, 70% by UN estimates of the people today are fed on small, basically subsistence farms around the country today. And again, if you look at the experiments that's done around the world, it's relatively easy to increase the productivity of those farms by 50 or 100 to 150% on the farms that are out there. We do not need industrial agriculture. We should not be coerced into saying that if we put regulations on industrial agriculture, then somehow we're going to all starve to death. It doesn't make common sense. It's not good science. It's just simply not true. Eventually, this industrial agricultural system must be replaced by a system that's sustainable. Industrial agriculture is simply not ecologically, socially, or economically sustainable over the long run. But in the meantime, we ought to have the courage and the guts to regulate industrial agriculture based on good science and common sense to ensure that it doesn't threaten the public health with pollution and it doesn't threaten future generations with depletion of our precious groundwater resources. If you have a 1,000-cow dairy CAFO, you're creating the biological waste of about 20 to 50,000 people, depending upon what you call as the biological completeness. And it uses about as much water as 1,000 or maybe 2,000 people. It is a major source of pollution, a major source of depletion, and it ought to be regulated as such. It's basically an industry that should be regulated as such. No other species could we have, or the human species, with that amount of waste. You wouldn't store it in pits and spread it on the area out around the town, and we shouldn't be doing it where we are today. There's things that they use to mitigate, such as digesters they talked about, but the digesters don't sterilize the product. You shouldn't be spraying this stuff all around. It still has biological contaminants. It's a very real public health risk, and the science is there to identify. Investors are the ones that reap the benefits. A few large-scale farming operations, they reap the benefits of pollution and depletion. It's the people of society and the communities that ultimately pay the cost. Thank you. Thank you.